First story, The Blue Entity, Crimean War, 1855. It was late in the afternoon, the sun barely peeking through the smoke-filled air as the battle raged on. I was with the Russian forces, stationed just outside the main lines, trying to keep my head low as the sounds of gunfire and cannon blasts filled the air. It was chaos all around us, men shouting, the sickening sound of metal cutting through flesh, and the ever-present smell of gunpowder and death. But something felt different that day. As I crouched behind a ruined stone wall trying to catch my breath, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was another soldier, someone trying to run for cover. But there was something off. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its movements were slow and deliberate, as though it wasn't bothered by the constant hail of bullets and explosions that seemed to come from every direction. The figure was walking right into the heart of the battle, right where men were falling like flies, their blood staining the muddy ground. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The man, or whatever it was, had skin that looked almost blue. Not like the blue of the sky on a clear day, but more of a sickly, unnatural shade, almost glowing in the dim light. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. There it was again, walking through the chaos like it didn't even notice the bullets whizzing by. It didn't duck. It didn't flinch. There was no fear in its stride, no hesitation. The soldiers around me were too busy with their own survival to notice, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My heart pounded in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming sense that whatever this was, it wasn't human. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Another soldier from my unit noticed it too, and before I could stop him, he started moving toward it. Cautiously, at first. I wanted to shout at him to stop, to get down, but my voice caught in my throat. There was something hypnotic about the figure, something that made you forget the danger around you. The soldier, young, barely a man, moved closer and closer to the blue-skinned figure, his eyes wide with what could only be described as awe. He didn't even seem to notice the constant barrage of gunfire. The figure continued to walk with that same eerie calmness, its long legs stretching as it passed through the battlefield. And then, just like that, right as the soldier was within a few feet, it disappeared. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had melted into the very air itself. The soldier stopped dead in his tracks, looking around in confusion, and I swear I could hear his breath catch in his throat. No one spoke for a long time. It was as if we were all afraid to speak the words that might make it real. I can't explain it. But something in that moment felt off. Like the whole world had just stopped spinning. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. I looked at the other soldiers, but they were just as frozen as I was, their eyes wide with disbelief. No one said anything for what felt like an eternity. The sound of battle seemed to fade away in the background, like it was happening on another planet, far removed from where we stood. I could still feel the cold, biting air, the smell of blood and death hanging thick in the air. But I couldn't focus on that anymore. All I could think about was that figure, the blue-skinned being that had walked among us as if it didn't care about the violence around it. What the hell was that? Slowly, as if waking from some kind of trance, one of the soldiers muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. He was trembling, his eyes darting around the battlefield like he was expecting to see something else, something even worse. The others started to murmur, each of them trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. But no one could explain it. There were no words for what we had seen, and that made it all the more terrifying. The thought that none of us had the faintest clue about what was happening. It gnawed at me, stuck in my throat like a piece of broken glass. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I couldn't. What was the point? What could I even say that would make sense? As the minutes dragged on, the gunfire slowly returned to its deafening rhythm. But something felt different now. The whole battlefield felt hollow. It wasn't like before when it was all just noise and chaos. Now, it felt like the world was watching us, waiting for something to happen. But none of us knew what. I looked at the soldier who had tried to approach the figure. His eyes were wide, staring at the spot where it had vanished. He looked like he had seen a ghost, like he had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. And I guess, in a way, he had. We all had. What had just happened? Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? Or had we just witnessed something that no human mind could comprehend? I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far worse, something more real than anything I'd ever known, and that was the scariest part. I didn't sleep that night. No one did. The sound of gunfire still echoed in my head, mixing with the image of that strange figure, its glowing blue skin and those massive dark eyes. I couldn't shake the image no matter how hard I tried. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that we'd all just seen some trick of the mind brought on by the madness of war. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. We all knew. You could see it in their eyes. The soldiers, the ones who'd seen the thing as well, had a different look in them now. They weren't talking about it, but they didn't need to. Their faces said it all. Fear, confusion. We were all trying to process the impossible. I couldn't focus on anything else, not even the battle we were in the middle of. Every time I blinked, I saw those eyes staring back at me. I could still feel that eerie, unnatural presence like it was haunting me from within the pit of my chest. The next morning, we went out on patrol. The fog had settled in thick around the camp, making everything seem even more surreal, like we were walking through a dream. But it wasn't a dream. I kept reminding myself that. When we reached the edge of the battlefield, I had to fight the urge to turn and run. That's where we'd seen it, where it had appeared, walking slowly between the bodies of the fallen soldiers, like it was observing us, judging us. And it didn't make sense. I could still see its shape in my mind, clearer now than ever before, the way it moved, almost casually, as if it didn't care about the danger around it. I wanted to believe I was just imagining things, but then I saw it. The blood stains were still fresh, the signs of the previous day's battle still marked, in the dirt. But there was something else there too, something that didn't belong. It wasn't long before another soldier spotted it too. He froze, just like I had the day before, his eyes wide in terror as he pointed to the horizon. I followed his gaze, heart sinking into my stomach. There it was again, standing in the distance. That same figure, that same unnerving presence. It wasn't moving this time, it was standing still, almost as if it was waiting for us. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on my palms. I wanted to shout, to warn the others, but I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed, caught between fear and the need to understand what was happening. It was too much, too unreal. My mind couldn't make sense of it. The thing was still there, watching us, and for the first time I felt like we were the ones being hunted. The seconds dragged by like hours as we stood there, watching it. The air was heavy, thick with tension, and the sounds of battle seemed to fade into the background. It felt like we were all holding our breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, almost statue-like, and yet it felt alive, aware of us. Like it could see every single one of us, despite the distance. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs shaking from the weight of the fear pressing down on me. But we couldn't just stand there forever. Slowly, we started to move forward, step by slow step, our eyes never leaving the creature in the distance. As we approached, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder, the light seemed to dim, like we were walking into some kind of shadow. I don't know how to explain it, but everything felt wrong. There was no sound. It was as if the whole world had just gone silent, and all we could hear was the pounding of our own hearts. My throat tightened with dread. I wanted to turn around to run as far away as I could, but my feet were glued to the ground, compelled to move closer, even though I knew we were heading straight into something we didn't understand. When we were within 100 yards of it, I thought I saw it move. A slight shift of its posture, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me freeze. It wasn't that it was walking toward us. It was like it was acknowledging our presence, as if it knew we were coming and was waiting for us to get closer. The chill in the air intensified, and I could feel a strange pressure on my chest, like the weight of the universe was bearing down on me. Then, as if the moment was finally too much for us to bear, one of the soldiers, a man named Ivan, stepped forward. I don't know why, but he was the first to break our formation, moving as though he was drawn to the creature. My instinct screamed at me to stop him, but I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. He walked toward it with slow, deliberate steps. His face was pale, his eyes wide and terrified, but he didn't turn back. We all watched in horror as he approached the alien figure. But when he was just a few feet away, the thing did something that made my blood run cold. It turned its head, locking eyes with Ivan, and that's when everything changed. It wasn't the way it looked at him. No, it was something more. It was the feeling. Like it wasn't just observing us, but probing our very souls. A sense of dread that was so deep, so overwhelming. I thought I might collapse right there. And that's when it happened. Just like that, Ivan vanished. There was no sound, no flash of light, nothing. He was simply gone. And so was the creature. I don't know what happened after that. Everything after Ivan's disappearance became a blur, a chaotic mess of confusion and panic. Some of the soldiers started shouting, others ran in the opposite direction, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed. The thing that had been there just moments ago was no longer in sight. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it had. I felt it. I still feel it. And the worst part is that we never spoke of it again. Not to each other, not to anyone. It was like we all agreed to pretend it never happened. But I can't forget. Every night, I hear the sound of Ivan's boots in my head, like he's still out there somewhere, caught in whatever strange place that thing took him to. I wish I could forget, but the image of that blue-skinned figure and those eyes, they haunt me. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know why it was there. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of terror before, and I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. The days that followed were filled with confusion and a deep sense of loss. No one mentioned Ivan again, and the memory of that strange figure started to fade. replaced by the chaos of the war. But there was something different about the way the other soldiers looked at me. Their eyes were filled with fear, as though they knew that what we had witnessed wasn't just a hallucination or a trick of the mind. I tried to push it out of my thoughts to focus on the battle, but it lingered in the corners of my mind like a shadow, always there, just out of reach. I would hear the sounds of war, the cries of the wounded, the clash of swords, the roar of cannons. But it all seemed so distant, so meaningless compared to the feeling that Creature had left behind. I began to notice strange things. Soldiers, who had been in the same area where Ivan disappeared, would sometimes report feeling as though they were being watched, like eyes were following them from unseen places. It wasn't just one or two men, it was everyone. It spread like a sickness, a fear that seemed to grow with every passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in that field, something that went beyond the war itself. It wasn't just the air that felt different, it was the land. It felt as if the earth itself had been marked by the presence of that thing, like a scar that no one could see, but everyone could feel. As the battle raged on, strange things kept happening. On several occasions, soldiers reported seeing flashes of blue light in the distance, like the glow of a distant fire, but there was no source, no fire, no explanation. Just a cold, eerie glow that would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. The whispers among the men started to grow louder. Tales of the Creature, of Ivan's disappearance, of things that didn't make sense. But there was one story that caught my attention more than the others. It was told by a man who swore he had seen the figure again. He claimed that, in the dead of night, while everyone else was asleep, he had wandered away from camp, drawn to a strange light in the distance. He said he came upon a clearing, and there, standing in the middle, was the blue figure. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just standing still, watching. It was moving, walking slowly, as if searching for something or someone. The man said that when he tried to approach, the creature turned its head and looked directly at him. And in that instant, he felt a wave of fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. He described it as a feeling of complete and utter helplessness, like his very existence was being questioned. He ran, of course, but not before he swore. He heard something, a voice, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. The voice spoke one word in a language that he didn't understand, but it was enough to send him running back to camp, shaken to his core. After hearing that, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening, something far beyond the scope of war. The men were becoming more paranoid, more afraid. Even the officers, who were usually so steadfast, were beginning to act strangely, as though they too could feel the shift in the air. We were no longer fighting just an enemy army, we were fighting something we couldn't comprehend. I began to wonder if we were being hunted, if that creature was not just observing us, but picking us off one by one. Every night I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the battlefield, muffled explosions, the cries of the wounded. But what really kept me awake was the thought of that blue-skinned figure. What did it want? What had it done to Ivan? Where had it come from? I couldn't make sense of it, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I had seen the figure myself, but even so it didn't seem real. It was like it existed in some other dimension, somewhere between reality and dream. Yet, at the same time, I knew it wasn't a dream. It was too vivid, too real, too powerful to be just a figment of our imagination. A week later, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. The battle had died down for the moment, and we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. But that night, when the moon was full and the stars filled the sky, something in the distance caught my eye. It was a soft, glowing light, just like the men had described. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The curiosity, the fear, the need to understand, it all pulled me toward it. I grabbed my rifle and silently crept out of the camp, keeping to the shadows, moving quietly as I had seen the others do. The closer I got, the more intense the glow became, until it seemed to fill the entire night. And there it was, standing, in the same place as before. The blue-skinned figure, tall and imposing, yet somehow serene. It didn't seem to notice me at first, but as I stood there, frozen, it slowly turned its head toward me. The moment our eyes met, everything around me went still. It wasn't the silence of night. It was a deeper silence, one that went beyond sound. It was like time had stopped, like the world itself had paused just for us. And then, in that frozen moment, I felt it again. The wave of dread, of incomprehensible fear. It wasn't a feeling I could put into words. It was a deep, primal terror that gripped my chest and made it hard to breathe. But even more than that, I felt a pull, a connection, like I was being drawn into its very essence. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the creature turned away and began walking slowly into the dark, fading into the night, just as it had before. And for the first time, I understood. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't some trick of the mind. This was real, and I was caught in something far bigger than anything I could comprehend, something that would change everything. Second story, Brought Back by the Light, France, 1948. It was late spring of 1948 when I first heard the story of Private James Walker. I was just a young man back then, freshly assigned to a desk job in the military archives. Nothing particularly special about that time except for the occasional file to go through, or a misplaced folder that needed tracking down. It was just routine, until I stumbled across the report that would change everything. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first glance, just another soldier missing in action during the war, one of thousands who vanished in the chaos of battle. But this one was different. The report stated that James Walker, an American infantryman, had been reported missing near the end of the war in 1945. They presumed him dead. The standard protocol, death in combat, and the case was closed. What made me pause was a second file marked reopening. T. It came from France 3 years later, in 1948. James Walker had been found, alive, in a French military cemetery wearing his uniform from 1945, completely intact, no signs of wear, no aging. His face was unchanged, as though time hadn't touched him at all. I'll admit, at first I thought it was some kind of clerical error or maybe a mistake. How could someone go missing in 1945, presumed dead, only to turn up 3 years later with no explanation? But as I read the report more thoroughly, something deep inside me told me it wasn't just a mistake. The details were unsettling. The soldiers who had found him in the cemetery spoke of him being in a state of confusion. He wasn't speaking, at first. When he did finally speak, it was just one sentence. The light brought me back. That was all. No explanations, no recognition of the situation he was in, no clear understanding of what had happened to him or where he had been. At first, they thought it was the trauma of war. Maybe a breakdown, a confused man who had wandered off during the chaos of battle and lost his memory. But there was something about his eyes, the way he looked at people, that sent shivers down their spines. He wasn't acting like someone who had simply been lost. It was as though he had seen something far worse. When I got access to the interviews conducted by the French officers, I felt a cold sweat creep up my neck. The man, Private Walker, was examined by doctors, military officials, and psychologists. The reports all came back the same. He was physically healthy, mentally sound for the most part. But there was an air of unease about him. And then I found out about the light. The witnesses had described it as a strange, glowing orb hovering above him as he stood in the cemetery. Some thought it was just a trick of the light, the reflection of headlights from a passing truck, but those who saw it swore it wasn't. According to them, it moved. It hovered above him, and when it disappeared, that's when Private Walker started to speak, repeating those same words over and over again. The light brought me back. There were conflicting accounts. Some said he appeared in perfect health, not a day older than when he had gone missing. Others claimed he looked slightly off, as if his eyes were too wide, his skin too pale, almost unearthly. His uniform, which had been issued to him in 1945, was pristine. Not a stain, no dirt, no weathering, nothing. Not a mark of time. The more I looked into it, the more disturbing it became. There were no records of James Walker ever being declared dead officially, no documents, nothing from the battlefield that confirmed his death, just a disappearance. But no body was ever recovered either. The military didn't know what to make of it, so they filed the case away. What really haunted me were the details that the French officers had left out of their report. Off the record, I had heard from some of the people who were there that, in the days following his discovery, Walker had been seen standing motionless for hours in the cemetery, his eyes fixed on a distant point, almost as if he was waiting for something to happen. But the strangest part, the moment anyone tried to approach him, he would become visibly agitated. Not in a violent way, but it was clear he was afraid. It was almost as if he feared whatever it was that had brought him back. One of the officers mentioned that on more than one occasion, Walker would mutter something under his breath in a language that nobody recognized. It wasn't German, it wasn't English, it wasn't anything they could trace, but it sounded ancient, almost like a chant or prayer. That's when I started to get the feeling that maybe this wasn't some simple case of a soldier lost in battle. Maybe, just maybe, something far darker had occurred. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Walker, it wasn't something of this world. The idea of a soldier who had died in 1945 only to return, completely intact without aging a day, felt like something out of a science fiction novel. But the evidence was there, right in front of me. They kept him in a holding facility for several weeks before sending him back to the United States for further questioning. During that time, he was constantly under observation. I managed to get my hands on one of the testimonies from one of the officers who had spent the most time with Walker. The man said that one night, when the power went out in the facility, Walker had just stood by his bed staring at the darkness and whispered, "The light is waiting for me." The officer tried to ask him what he meant, but Walker just shook his head and repeated the phrase over and over again, like it was a prayer. They say the moment the lights came back on, Walker collapsed to his knees, as if the weight of the world had hit him all at once. And when they finally released him to go back home, he was almost a different person. But he was never the same after that. He never spoke of it again. No one could get him to explain what had happened. As I dug deeper into Walker's past, I discovered something even more unsettling. The military had kept a file on him, a file that had been buried for years, hidden from public record. It was dated back to 1943, and it spoke of something far beyond the realm of normal military protocol. Private James Walker had been part of a classified experiment conducted by the U.S. Army, a project that involved strange, unexplainable phenomena. It was all highly classified, but in the few files that had been declassified, there were whispers of soldiers being exposed to unusual experiments with light, sound, and even time itself. I know it sounds insane, but there were multiple accounts that spoke of light anomalies occurring during testing. The military had been trying to harness the power of light, they said, to create a new kind of weapon. But something went wrong. The files were vague, but it was clear that Walker had been involved in something that was not just about warfare. No one had ever made the connection between the experiments and Walker's disappearance. But after everything I read, it became clear to me that something far more sinister had happened. I couldn't help but think, had Walker somehow crossed paths with something not human? Was that what had happened in that cemetery? Had the light he spoke of been a remnant of whatever had gone wrong with that experiment? As I pieced everything together, I started to question what the light really was. Was it a form of energy, something unknown to us that could bridge the gap between life and death? Or was it a trap? Something that drew people in, pulled them across some boundary they were never meant to cross. The more I thought about it, the more I believed that Walker had been pulled into something much bigger than any of us could understand, something that might have existed long before the war began, and maybe even before humanity itself. What if this was an ancient force, something connected to the earth, or even to the stars? What if the military had uncovered a power far beyond their comprehension, and Walker was just one of many who had paid the price for their experiments? And what was the significance of the cemetery where he was found? Could it have been a place where this light had once been active, where its influence had become so strong that it literally resurrected him? The cemetery itself had an eerie history dating back to the Napoleonic Wars, but there was something else about it. Something older than the war, older than the soldiers who had been buried there. The final piece of the puzzle came when I found a witness, someone who had been present the day Walker was found. A French historian, now elderly, who had spent decades researching the area. He told me that there had been whispers among the locals about strange happenings near that particular cemetery. They believed that the site was built upon ancient ruins, possibly Celtic, and that the land held some kind of power. The historian mentioned old texts that spoke of beings of light that could travel between worlds, creatures from the other side who could bring the dead back to life under certain conditions. I had heard rumors about the military being involved in occult practices during World War II. Some even claimed they had been trying to tap into the supernatural to create super soldiers. But this historian's story was different. He was convinced that there was a connection between the strange light Walker had seen and something ancient and alien. According to him, the light was not of this earth. It was a force that had existed long before humanity even came into being, and somehow Walker had come into contact with it, and it had changed him. The soldier who had once been part of the war was now a part of something far beyond his understanding. the most chilling part of all of this. Walker himself seemed to know that whatever had happened to him wasn't something he could ever escape. When I last spoke to him, several years after his return to the United States, he had become a shadow of the man he once was. He had stopped talking about the light. He had stopped talking altogether. Instead, he spent his days wandering the streets, speaking to people who weren't there, and staring at the sky as if waiting for something to appear. He had become obsessed with the idea that the light would return for him, that it was only a matter of time before he would be called back. And the worst part was that no one really knew how much time had passed since he had first disappeared. His age, his physical appearance, none of it made sense. Some doctors speculated that Walker had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown, that the trauma of war and whatever experiments the military had done to him had fractured his mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way he had spoken about the light, the way his eyes would glaze over whenever the subject came up, there was something more to it. I couldn't help but think that Walker had crossed some threshold, and that the light he referred to wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, and it had a hold on him now. As time passed, I couldn't stop thinking about Walker, about the strange events that had led to his return, and about the implications of everything I had learned. I had spent so much time chasing the truth, trying to understand what had happened to him, but I realized that there were things in this world, things in the universe, that we simply can't explain. No matter how much we want answers, sometimes the answers remain hidden, locked away in places we can't reach, in forces we can't comprehend. Walker's story was a reminder of that. A reminder that there are mysteries out there that are far beyond us, things that may never be fully understood, things that may never be meant for us to understand. His life, his death, and his return. Maybe it wasn't about finding closure. Maybe it was about realizing that there are some things that exist outside the realm of logic, and that we may never be ready to confront them. Walker was gone now. His story just another footnote in history, but his disappearance and his strange return would never leave me. It had changed me. And maybe that's what the light had been trying to show all along. Some truths are better left in the dark. The more I reflected on Walker's case, the more questions I had. Why was he the only one who had been chosen by the light? What about the other soldiers who had been lost, whose bodies were never recovered? Were they also touched by this mysterious force, or had they simply been forgotten? Walker's return seemed like an anomaly, but what if it wasn't? What if, in some strange way, he was just one piece of a much larger puzzle? I spent countless hours diving into records, trying to find connections between other soldiers who had disappeared under similar circumstances, but nothing concrete ever came up. Most of the soldiers were reported dead, and that was the end of it. Some families never even knew what had truly happened to their loved ones. The military had long since swept the matter under the rug. But there was something about Walker's story that kept gnawing at me. Something that felt unfinished, like a book with its last pages torn out. I eventually turned to the paranormal for answers. If the military had been experimenting with occult powers during the war, surely there would be others who had experienced something similar. I met with paranormal researchers, spiritualists, and even former soldiers who had been involved in the occult during the war. The more I dug, the more the pieces began to fit together in unexpected ways. Some researchers spoke of light beings who were said to traverse realms, traveling between worlds, while others claimed that certain ancient artifacts held the key to unlocking the power of life and death. As wild as it sounded, the more I learned, the more it seemed like there was a secret history tied to Walker's case. One that spanned centuries, one that had been hidden by powerful people with an agenda of their own. One of the researchers, an old man with deep-set eyes and a voice that trembled with age, claimed that these beings were not just figments of imagination. He said that they were entities that could exist outside of time, who could intervene in human lives when certain conditions were met. Was it possible that Walker had stumbled upon such a being, an entity that had brought him back from death, only to leave him trapped in a world he no longer understood? Was the light truly a portal to another dimension? Or was it something else entirely? Something darker, more sinister? I started to piece together a theory based on what I had learned. What if Walker hadn't actually died when he was reported missing? What if, instead of dying on the battlefield, he had been transported into another plane of existence, one where time moved differently? It was almost as if he had been taken by the light and placed in a place where he could exist between life and death, a realm outside of our understanding. Maybe that's why he came back the way he did, like a man who had been trapped in a moment of time, suspended between two worlds. The uniform he wore when found, perfectly intact and free of any signs of aging, could be evidence of this. If time didn't move in the same way in that other realm, then it would explain why he looked the same as he had when he first disappeared, and the fact that he had no memory of the years that had passed. Maybe that was a result of the disorienting nature of being pulled from one world to another. His mind, unable to process the transition, could only hold on to the vague memory of the light that brought him back. The deeper I went, the more I began to realize that the light wasn't just some simple occurrence. It wasn't just some strange phenomenon that happened to a random soldier. No, it felt deliberate. It felt like a test, like some higher power or force was watching, observing. Walker had been chosen, but for what? Was he a pawn in a game much larger than anyone could imagine? I started to question everything I had been told about the war, about history, about the very nature of life and death. Maybe what had happened to Walker wasn't an isolated incident at all. Perhaps across the world there were other men and women who had disappeared, only to be brought back by the same force, unable to speak about what they had experienced. Maybe the government, in their desperation to create something greater than human, had uncovered a force that even they couldn't control, a force that was never meant to be understood. The more I delved into the research, the more I wondered if Walker had been the first, or if there had been others before him, all lost to time and memory. Could there be more people out there, walking among us, carrying the remnants of an experience that defied all logic? I reached out to some of the surviving family members of the other soldiers from that battle. Some were open to hearing my theory, but most of them were too entrenched in their own pain to entertain such wild ideas. To them, their loved ones were dead, their stories finished. They had mourned their losses and moved on. But some, those who still had unanswered questions, listened, asking me to keep digging, to keep searching for answers. As I followed these leads, I began to realize just how deeply the military and even some spiritual groups had buried the truth. It wasn't just about one soldier or one mysterious disappearance. It was about a system of control, of hidden knowledge, and of forces beyond human comprehension that had been left unchecked for far too long. Walker's return, his brief moment in the light, was just the beginning. There were many more pieces to this puzzle, and I had barely scratched the surface. The deeper I went into this investigation, the more I saw that Walker was not just a man who had returned from the dead. He was a symbol of something greater, something that we weren't ready to confront, and maybe we never would be. In the end, the answers I sought didn't come easy, and they may never come at all. The light that had drawn Walker back, that strange force from another realm, was not something I could fully understand. But as I stood on the edge of it all, I realized that some mysteries were meant to remain mysteries. Some questions were meant to linger in the darkness, unanswered and unknown. And maybe, just maybe, that was for the best. Because the truth about the light, the truth about what happened to Walker and countless others like him, it wasn't something that any of us were meant to know. Not yet, at least. Maybe the light wasn't something we should try to understand. Maybe it was better to let it be, to leave it in the shadows where it belonged. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story. The soldiers who disappeared in the sky. Crimea, 1854. It was the dead of night. The battlefield stretched out beneath a heavy, dark sky. I can still hear the distant echo of gunfire, the soft murmurs of men preparing for another day of hell. This was the Crimean War, 1854, but what I saw that night, I don't think anyone would believe it, not even now. The soldiers around me, most of us exhausted and battered, were trying to catch whatever rest we could, but the tension was unbearable. We were waiting for dawn. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something was wrong, like a storm was on the horizon, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of weight on my chest before or since. But then something happened. Something that still haunts me. It started with a flicker. At first, it seemed like a star, too bright and too low. I didn't think much of it. But then I saw other soldiers looking up too. The flickering turned into a steady glow, a silver-white light that grew stronger by the second. We weren't the only ones who saw it. There was a whole group of us staring at the sky, frozen in place, mouths agape. The light seemed to move slowly, almost like it was dancing across the sky. And then it hovered. It wasn't a star, not a plane, and definitely not any kind of natural phenomenon. I don't know how to describe it, but the thing, it was a sphere. A perfect sphere glowing brightly with a metallic sheen that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It just hung there, silent, watching us, watching me. I could feel my heart racing. The men around me started murmuring, shifting uncomfortably. I wasn't sure what to think, but the unease was spreading like wildfire. We weren't alone in this place, not anymore. And then, it happened. The sphere, as if it had a mind of its own, began to move, slowly at first, then faster. It drifted closer and closer to us, the light intensifying with each passing moment. Some men backed away, others just stared, not sure what to do. There was this strange hum that seemed to fill the air, vibrating in the very core of my chest. And that's when the beam came. It wasn't a flash, no sudden burst, just a steady, blinding beam of light coming straight down from the sphere. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My legs felt like they were locked in place, my body frozen. In terror, I don't remember exactly when I was enveloped by the light, but it was like being trapped in a dream, only this one was more real than anything I'd ever felt. The beam didn't burn, but it had this pulling sensation, like gravity had turned against me. I tried to scream, to run, but nothing worked. My legs felt heavy, like they weren't mine anymore. The soldiers around me, those who hadn't been caught in the light, were staring, helpless. They couldn't move either. It was like the whole world had paused. The air was thick, choking, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow, as if I was suffocating without actually being able to take a deep breath. I looked around, trying to find someone, anyone, to make sense of this. But the others, those who hadn't been caught in the beam, just stood there, watching, their faces pale with fear. They couldn't help. I don't know how long I was floating in that beam, or if floating is even the right word for it. It wasn't like I was in the air, more like the light was lifting me, pulling me upwards, yet my feet never left the ground. The world below me was starting to distort. The edges of my vision blurred, and the sounds around me faded to nothing. I could no longer hear the distant artillery fire or the cries of my comrades. Everything became muffled, like I was underwater. I tried to scream again, but my voice was trapped in my throat, caught by the invisible force that held me. I felt weightless, like I was being lifted into something somewhere else. And then, without warning, the light suddenly flashed, and I was no longer on the battlefield. It wasn't like I was in another place, but it felt wrong, like I had been torn from one reality and thrown into another. The place I found myself in. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like time had stopped. Everything around me was dark, yet not completely. The air was thick and stale, heavy with a kind of oppression that made my chest tighten. I couldn't move at first, just suspended there, floating in the stillness. There were no walls, no floor, just this endless black void, stretching as far as the eye could see. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that feels like it's crushing your bones. But then, there were sounds, soft whispers, like voices just out of reach. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel them crawling under my skin, burrowing into my mind. And then, just as suddenly as the silence had come, a figure appeared. It wasn't a man, or anything I could describe, but it was tall, unnaturally tall, and its form was shadowed, like it was made of darkness itself. Its eyes, they weren't eyes. They were just these deep, empty pits staring into me. And then, it spoke. The figure's voice wasn't what I expected. It wasn't like a human voice at all. It wasn't even a voice. It was more like thoughts invading my mind, thoughts that weren't mine. They were cold, calculated, and heavy with something that made my skin crawl. It said, "You are not where you were meant to be." The words didn't come from its mouth. No, they came from within me, deep in my mind, like it had unlocked something in me that I never knew was there. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was completely paralyzed, trapped in this endless black void with this thing, whatever it was, towering over me. I felt it studying me, its gaze, if you could call it that, burning into the deepest parts of my soul. And then the light came again. Not the same light, but a different one. This one was colder, harsher, and it felt like it was burning my very thoughts. It wasn't right. None of it was right. My chest tightened as the light surrounded me once more, but this time it was different. The air began to crackle like electricity building up, charging the space around me. I could feel my muscles trembling, my body fighting against the force that was controlling me, pulling me in all directions. The whispers started again, but they weren't whispers anymore. They were commands, demands. It was like the thing was trying to communicate with me, forcing information into my mind that I couldn't fully understand. But I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't friendly. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. I wanted to die right there, just so I could escape the suffocating grip of whatever this was. My heart was racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. Then, all at once, the pressure stopped. Just stopped. And in that moment of pure, suffocating silence, I could feel my body hit the ground, slamming down so hard it felt like my bones would break. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the battlefield. The sounds of war, those explosions, the cries of soldiers came rushing back, and I could feel the heat of the sun on my skin again. I wasn't sure if it had been minutes or hours. Everything felt wrong, like I was out of sync with reality. My legs shook as I pushed myself up, trying to find my bearings. But then I saw them, my comrades, the ones who had been standing by when the light took us. They were still standing there, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. And then I noticed something even worse. The spot where the beam had taken us was empty, no sign of the other soldiers. They were just gone, like they had never existed. I thought maybe I was going crazy, but the unease in my gut wouldn't let me forget what had happened. The fear in my comrades' eyes told me everything I needed to know. No one had seen what I had seen. No one had felt what I had felt. I was alone in this nightmare. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, as if the very air around us had been drained of life. I could see the fear in my comrades' eyes, but it wasn't just fear of the battle. We were all scared of something else now, something we couldn't explain. I wanted to scream, to shout out to them, but my voice felt like it was trapped in my throat, stuck somewhere between what I had just experienced and the grim reality I was still in. We were standing in the middle of a war zone, the sounds of explosions in the distance, yet everything felt muted, unreal, as if we were in a dream that we couldn't wake up from. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. Where were the others? The ones who had disappeared into that beam of light? I didn't dare ask aloud. I already knew. They weren't coming back. They had been taken. By what, though? What had happened to them? What had happened to me? I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as if someone was watching me, but I couldn't see anyone else. The field was empty. No bodies, no soldiers, just the faint echo of the distant sounds of war. It felt like the battlefield had been abandoned, like I had been left behind in some twisted version of reality that no one else could see. I stumbled forward, my legs still unsteady, as I tried to make my way back to the camp. Every step I took felt like I was walking through thick fog, my mind racing, my thoughts scattered. My heart kept pounding in my chest, reminding me that I was still alive. But at the same time, I felt completely disconnected from everything around me. The world. I knew everything I understood was slipping through my fingers like sand. I couldn't tell if it was the aftermath of the battle, the exhaustion, or if something deeper had happened, something that had changed the very fabric of reality itself. When I reached the camp, I found the others, sitting around the fire, just like they always did after a long day of fighting. But something was off. They were all looking at me with blank expressions, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they were seeing something that wasn't there. They didn't speak. They didn't move. It was as if they were frozen in time, stuck in a moment that wasn't real. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, but even that seemed too distant, too hollow. I tried to call out to them, but my voice was barely a whisper. It felt like it didn't even belong to me anymore. I was losing myself, bit by bit, as if I was being erased from existence. "What's happening?" I whispered to myself. But no answer came. Then, without warning, the light returned. It wasn't like the blinding flash I had seen before, but this time, it was subtle, slow, almost deliberate. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping suddenly, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The figures around me started to shift, their forms becoming more distorted, like reflections in a cracked mirror. I tried to move, tried to run, but my body refused to obey. My muscles were frozen, locked in place, as if whatever force had taken the others was now reaching for me. I could feel the pull again, that strange magnetic force, dragging me towards something I couldn't see. It was like I was being tugged through a doorway that wasn't there, and just as quickly as it had appeared, the light faded, leaving me standing alone once more. But everything was different. The camp, the soldiers, the battlefield, nothing looked the same. It was as if the world around me had shifted, like I had been transported to another place, another time, where none of this made sense. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what was happening, but all I could hear was the distant sound of the wind, as if the earth itself was sighing in defeat. My heart was still racing, pounding in my chest like it wanted to escape. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I felt like I was being drawn deeper into something I couldn't control. I tried to breathe, but each breath felt heavier than the last. My thoughts were all over the place, scattered like pieces of a broken puzzle, and I couldn't even begin to put them together. I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but it felt like my voice was stuck inside, as though I wasn't even real anymore. The soldiers around me were still there, standing motionless, their faces frozen in a blank stare, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I was terrified. What had happened to the men who disappeared earlier, the ones who had been taken by the beam of light? Were they lost forever, or had they been changed in some way? I didn't know, and the more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was sinking into an endless void of uncertainty. The reality around me was slipping, and I was powerless to stop it. As I stumbled through the camp, my vision blurred and my body unsteady, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if they were alive, creeping toward me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had seen enough horror in my life to know that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. My mind was screaming for answers, but every time I tried to focus, it felt like the world itself was slipping out of my grasp. It was as if the laws of nature had been rewritten, and I was standing in the middle of a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The sound of the distant explosions was still there, but it felt so far away, like they were happening in another world entirely. It was as though time itself was warping around me, pulling everything into a vortex of confusion. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before I lost myself completely. But as I turned to run, I felt it again. The pull, that magnetic force tugging at my chest, guiding me toward something I couldn't see. I didn't have the strength to resist anymore. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the edge of the camp, toward the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The world around me was fading, but I could still feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, my legs too weak to carry me. But still, I walked, unable to stop. The pull grew stronger, more insistent, as if something or someone was calling me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the sky above me was now a swirling mass of dark clouds, as though the heavens themselves were in turmoil. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, and with each step, the world around me seemed to blur more and more. I could hear voices now, distant whispers, but when I tried to listen, they vanished, leaving me in total silence once again. It felt like I was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I wasn't sure anymore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the camp. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of what I had just experienced hung heavy in the atmosphere. The soldiers behind me were still standing motionless, their faces expressionless, as if they were stuck in a time loop, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I was completely alone. I looked out into the darkness ahead, unsure of what to do next. But I felt the pull again, stronger than ever. This time it wasn't just a force. I could feel it in my bones, in my very
soul.
Whatever had taken the others, whatever had caused this strange phenomenon, was still out there, and it was calling to me. I didn't know what it wanted, or why I was being drawn to it, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to follow it. There was no other choice. As I stepped forward, the ground beneath me shifted, and I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. Something was with me, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was waiting for me to move, to make the next choice. And as I took another step, I realized I was no longer just a soldier. I was something else now, something different. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.